Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 7th webinar for the Sustainable Cities MOOC. This week is a catch-up week, and today with us we have Mr. Allan Lavell, a world-renowned expert in urban risk, vulnerability, and disaster. And we're going to discuss the same theme, which is a very critical aspect pertaining to sustainable cities. His work in the field, in his particular subject work, spans for more than 3 decades, and it is marked by multidisciplinary, holistic, and participatory comparative approaches. He was the founding member of the Network of Social Studies in the Prevention of Disasters in Latin America in 1992, and combined with his long-term relationship with the Latin America Social Science faculty, which enables him to achieve a position of influence within the region and beyond. In 2015, he was awarded the United Nations Sasakawa Award for Disaster Risk and Reduction. Allan, over to you now.
Okay, well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. I'm not sure what it is. Yeah, here where I am, it's 5 o'clock in the morning, and I'm sure where other people are, it's much later. So probably people are far more awake than I am. But anyway, it's nice to be online. Well, maybe just a few words based on what was in the video and the originally short written piece. To sort of frame the conversation today and the questions which may be posed. Yeah, basically what we're dealing with is, or the title was Cities, Urban Centres and Vulnerability. Well, that vulnerability, which is defined in a very simple way as the proneness or the way in which people, societies, livelihoods are subject to suffer loss and damage, impact, once damaging events, which normally are physical events, occur, but it could be socio-economic events as well. In our case, we're dealing with physical events like earthquakes, flooding, tornadoes, etc. You know, vulnerability is just a proneness to suffer damage because of certain social, economic, physiological, even psychological, historical, cultural conditioning factors. And so when we're talking about vulnerability, we're talking about vulnerability in the frame of what is urban disaster risk. We could talk about vulnerability in the frame of a series of other conditioning factors or conditioning stress factors, but we're concentrating particularly on physical factors, what are called natural hazards in many ways, but many of which are not in fact natural hazards. They are more what we would call socio-natural hazards, that is, hazards that are created by an interface between society and the environment. So that's the topic we're dealing with. And what we basically are laying out in what we've said is that the vulnerability of population groups in the sense of being prone to suffer impacts is very much related in a holistic analysis to the existence of other conditions. Therefore, vulnerability is a derived condition, not something that comes from conditions which are specifically vulnerability based. And the major one there, although it is not vulnerability as such, is poverty, is the conditions of poverty, the exclusion on the part of many populations of access to welfare indicators, to infrastructure, to a whole series of factors which would give them a wider choice in society, a wider access to power and to demand, ask for things that make their lives make their lives more easy. And I'm sorry if I get a bit interrupted. I've got a really heavy chest, so it may interrupt me momentarily. And so what we're dealing with is a vulnerability which is poverty-based in general. That is not to say that all vulnerability in cities is poverty-based, but the vulnerability we're particularly interested in a world which is now over 50% urban, and a very substantial part of that 50% urban lives in conditions of poverty in the global south and in inadequate conditions in urban areas. That is the particular frame of reference we have, not vulnerability to disasters of middle class or upper class groups in cities, although that does exist as well for a diverse series of factors which don't relate to poverty but would relate to other factors. And what we basically lay out in what we were saying in the video is that that poverty can be associated with intra-urban poverty in the sense of population groups that have been born and bred in cities and are structurally poor because of reasons nothing to do with disaster risk, but for which disaster risk doesn't increase their poverty or throw them back into poverty or does not allow them to come out of poverty. But it can also be related, and this is a very significant factor today, in what are migration patterns to cities under conditions which are different even from the historical patterns, which were rural and urban migration in the search supposedly for better living conditions, or expelled from the countryside because of land reforms or technification of agriculture, etc. We now face the fact that many poor population groups are migrating to cities because of stress and violence in rural areas. In Latin America, for instance, in Colombia, we have massive migration of poor Venezuelan population to the cities in Colombia under the stress of economic stress in Venezuela and the sort of semi-dictatorship which has been set up there over the last years. But also there's lots of population that move because of civil conflict in rural areas associated with civil war within countries, and that's specific to countries, but it does exist. So migration to cities still exists. It is not the major part now of urban growth, but it does exist. And then what we're establishing is that poverty, the way it is expressed in cities as vulnerability, is filtered through a series of processes which we're calling urban processes. And here what we've tried to point out is there's a big difference, as far as I'm concerned, between risk in cities and urban risk. And I relate urban risk to the existence of certain processes which define urban centres as such. And those are, as we laid out, the notion of concentration, centralisation and densification of population and industry and services, the notion of environmental degradation, which takes a different form in cities. For instance, we find that if you're a poor population group living in slopes in cities, and you do in fact have access to forest resources, let's say, you're likely, because of a need for cooking or the need for heating, depending where you are, to in fact cut those trees and open yourself up to the creation of new hazards that didn't exist previously. So populations that were in previously secure areas, in mangrove swamps areas or in forested areas on slopes in cities, cutting down that vegetation then opens them up to landsliding, which didn't exist before. So environmental degradation, the different forms it has, contributes to the vulnerability and exposure of population groups to disaster. Then there's a whole problem of the synergy of cities, the interrelationship of its parts, the need for redundancy in urban infrastructure, where that redundancy doesn't exist in general affects more dramatically the poor population in the city. And the critical one, of course, which is linked into all of these, is the whole idea of socio-spatial segregation. That is, the city is made up of different functional areas which are associated with the working of an urban land market, and therefore poorer population groups do not have access to formal land markets in cities and land up having, not because they want to, having to occupy the more unsafe places on slopes or river flood zones or other areas subject to seismic faults or whatever. And so a combination of these things, along with the whole thing of urban governance, which tends to work in many cities through the urban land market and urban land developers, and other inadequate land use planning principles, environmental planning principles, leads to this increased condition of vulnerability. That is, a proneness to suffer disaster if you are in fact located in an area which is subject to hazard or hazards in multiple form at some time. And that means, and I'll stop there, that when we're talking about urban disaster risk, we're talking about the probability of future damage and loss associated with the occurrence of what we call physical events, which of diverse nature, which in their latent form, that is, when they have not happened but could happen, are called hazards. That is to say, a hazard does not impact anything. A hazard is the threat of a future which could be unfortunate. The real problem is when that hazard transforms itself, is actualized into a real event and touches on populations that are exposed to that event and under conditions of vulnerability. So the conclusion to all this is that disaster risk in all cases does not have its own independent movers or drivers. It has drivers which derive from development processes which are inadequately fulfilled, skewed development. Consequently, any chance of reducing disaster risk amongst poorer groups in cities is related to a more holistic approach to integrated development planning at an urban or at a national level. So maybe I'll stop with that, and then we can open it up to two questions. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Allan. Well, taking a note from what you were just discussing as to a socio-spatial segregation, I think this question is more from a social aspect. Arjun from Kathmandu would like to know. He says that it has been observed that in developing countries, women are subject to inequality in their daily lives, which is further intensified by a natural disaster, making them more vulnerable. Essentially, a disaster management mechanism is not gender sensitive, and almost always the women bear the brunt of it. What can be ways of making a gender sensitive disaster management plan?
Well, let us establish that is a completely correct statement, that there is social discrimination in the wider sense of the word throughout this topic. Second thing is that disasters do not, in general, cause poverty. Poverty is pre-disaster. There's been this whole message about the way in which disaster causes poverty. That is an excuse. Poverty is generally structurally created and then increased by the existence of disaster risk. And much of that disaster risk can be small-scale events. We're not talking about extreme events, which is the topics of today is all phrased around extreme events. This is not a problem of extreme events. Precisely, it's a problem of smaller, recurrent, medium-sized events which affect populations in a permanent way over a year, 2 years, 3 years. It's not the 100-year flood or the 100-year earthquake, although that obviously causes great problem. So the whole thing about gender incorporation, gender balance, etc., is a thing that has to be laid out, set up, and then the mechanisms found for it to be incorporated as a significant part, particularly we know in response, there's a wide-scale participation of females in the response. But this is also a prevention and mitigation thing. This is a thing about the sustenance of livelihoods. And as women are absolutely fundamental for the sustenance of livelihoods and family welfare, this thing should cross across the whole spectrum of what we would call a risk spectrum, not a disaster spectrum, because the risk is latent and the disaster is purely and simply the actualization of existing risk. So if we can deal with risk, we do not need to deal with disaster. Of course, that's a difficult thing.
I think one of the follow-up questions that we can have based on that is, Alex from Perth would like to know, is vulnerability to disaster risk rooted in the context of equity, where it is a result of unequal access to resources? What sort of an approach should a government take to address the existing vulnerabilities of people to improve the chances of addressing disaster risk?
Well, yeah, it is definitely, that is a major factor. Now, the approaches, it depends where you go. If you go to Africa, Asia, Latin America, if you go within Latin America to one country or another, different approaches will be found. But I personally do not find that most disaster risk management, and we can divide this into two or three types. Here in Latin America, we're now, when we talk about disaster risk management, we're talking about corrective management. That is where the risk already exists, either because of the existence, well, always the existence of a hazard and exposure, and vulnerability, where you could actually intervene on the hazard factor, the exposure factor, or the vulnerability factor. And I think this is important to state, because most people say that disaster risk reduction is about reducing vulnerability. That's not true. If you were to get rid of exposure, there would be no need to talk about vulnerability or hazard, because you can only be under hazardous conditions if you are exposed to the event. If you don't live on a slope, you don't live on the slope of a volcano, you don't live on the side of a river, you obviously can't be vulnerable to disaster. So if we could actually, probably it's much more easy to attack it from the side of exposure than vulnerability itself. That does not resolve the problem, of course, because vulnerability is rooted in the conditions of poverty, the lack of access to power, etc. But a lot of this could be by avoiding, but then we get into some very, very complex situations. For instance, if we look at relocation of urban population from areas exposed to hazards, and this is going to increase with climate change, and when we offer that relocation through NGOs or through government to the population groups, many times they refuse to move or do not want to move, which is basically a trade-off they're making between satisfying quotidian risk existence and solving their problems, even though it may be minimally, of employment, of access to income or access to land, as opposed to disaster risk, which is an eventual thing that comes every now and again, and which and so they stay put, or would prefer to stay put. But if we were to avoid that exposure in the first place, and this means urban planning principles well implemented, land banks on the part of local governments, discriminatory access to services as opposed to etc., etc. Because vulnerability reduction, what it basically means is increasing the available choices to the population, and that means increasing income, increasing social capital amongst groups working in community-based collective approaches to things. And I have not seen that much done, because there's no way of this is a little bit about like the topic of disaster risk governance. What is disaster risk governance if all disaster risk is related to unfulfilled development promises? And so what we're basically talking about is sustainable development governance geared up in the framework of disaster risk reduction. So risk governance doesn't really exist to me. You're not going to decentralize a country for disaster risk management if it isn't decentralized anyway. You're not going to get increased assignation of resources to something if it doesn't exist as a basic principle of government in general. And so, it's a very complex. It's complex. I've been in this topic now for 25 years. It's more complex than urban development because it's a related thing. It's out of your hands to resolve it as a disaster risk management planner. It's in development planners that it has to be undertaken.
Yes. That is true. I think for taking a cue from what you were speaking about right now, Paloma would like to know, if we look at the concept of inclusive cities, then how can a metropolitan city, which can be designed as an inclusive city, help in combating the vulnerability of urban spaces in these cities?
I'm not sure that metropolitan cities can be designed as inclusive cities because they exist. Nobody nowadays designs a metropolitan city. A metropolitan city occurs because of growth, conurbation, and amalgamation, etc. But it does indicate something really interesting, that we know that with urban growth in the world today, it is predominantly taking place in smaller, intermediate-sized cities. The metropolitan areas, it's not that they've reached their maximum size, but they now exist. anything of inclusivity in metropolitan cities today is a corrective thing. If exclusion exists today, it has to be corrected. Now, what we're talking about, the other side of disaster management planning, is prospective management. That is thinking the future. You in India, who now have, God knows, 1 point some odd billion, you can have 2 billions in 40 years. And where are they going to be living, under what conditions, etc. Now, if that all takes place in a great part in smaller intermediate cities, then the possibility of working with inclusion seems to be far greater, and the prospective approach to it seems to be far more accessible than within metropolitan areas, which are the problem with metropolitan areas. They're now there, they're now fixed. The exclusion is there. It requires massive investments. We know that over the next up to 2030, it's stated by Habitat and others that probably 50% of all urban growth, all urban investment in infrastructure which occurs, well, no, by then there will be double what exists today. So how is that urban infrastructure going to contribute to inclusion or exclusion? A lot of the problems we see now, for instance, in African cities, is even the planning of Dubai's in Africa, which are segregated cities. It seems as if on the map is the notion of segregated cities. And you go around a lot of cities of the world, they are segregated. They're divided down the middle, basically, with highly service assigned areas and others extremely excluded in terms of. So I'm not sure how you actually get to inclusion. I always say that I'm very grateful to be an academic, but I don't really have to search for the solution for what conceptually we set up as a problem. But that's not true. We do. But I'm not sure what the challenge is here, but it is in massive structural changes in economy and in the way we see development and we approach to life in general.
So in a way, it's probably the city planners who are providing more and more reason and opportunities for either creating disaster risk or making us think about it. I'm sure that's something we have to ponder on. The next question is from Deepak, who says that as per a recent report by the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, India saw over 1.3 million new displacement in 2017 from disasters. What do you think should be the adequate response in terms of mitigating climate-induced displacement as a way of combating this?
Well, that's an interesting thing, because the International Centre, which Beena Desai, who is in fact of Indian origin, is the Director of Research and Policy. And we're now involved in an initiative with them, and through a thing we're calling the Risk Nexus, which is being set up, which I think even the Indian Institute for Human Settlements is involved in. And one of the things to do with migration is to allow us to migrate from what has been an approach to migration seen primarily from a humanitarian angle. And that has been built up because of the UNHCR and everything else, their approaches to it. It is a humanitarian problem. It's a problem. It has existed. Now we have to resolve it. Now, the thing is that migration is obviously related to stresses in society. Those stresses may be disaster-induced, they may be violence-induced, they may be economic downturn-induced, etc. And it's massive, the amount. I'm not sure what the total sum is worldwide of movement in a single year, but Justin Giannetti, who's the head of data for the International Centre, I think he talked of something like 26 million people in a meeting last week in Mexico City. So it's a massive amount, and it's going to increase with climate change induced migration, etc. So you have one of two options. You either transform the conditions of existence in the point of origin, or you accommodate people in ways in their point of destiny. And what we're pressing for is far more interest in the point of origin and resolving or reducing the factors which push people out in migratory patterns. And this turns us back to the whole debate on rural-urban migration in the past. And even today, there are a lot of people who are arguing, well, why don't we just reform the rural areas such that we retain people. But we know that the whole logic of capital development today is not that way, that the world is over 50% urban, and it's going to be over 70% urban within 30 years. So the whole of the world. And then there are countries like the country I live in now is 80% urban in Costa Rica in Central America, as are a whole series of other countries. But it's a very important topic. And what it does illustrate here is that this whole topic of disaster risk management and disaster risk is not a specialized topic. It is a topic which derives from the existence of contradictions in multiple levels of society. So only by looking at it holistically, realizing that these things are derived from other things and then linking them into it. And then such that, for instance, they talk about mainstreaming disaster risk into development planning. It isn't a matter of mainstreaming it, it's a matter of making people realize that development cannot create risk or should not create risk. But we know that development does create, in commas, does create risk. So it's not a matter of exogenous impacts on an innocent society. It's a matter of a very culpable society, maybe not knowing it, creating the very conditions for the risk they live in and therefore the disaster that occurs.
Yes, I think we have to look a bit into ourselves, be a little more introspective when we talk about disasters. I think the next question is looking more at the flip side, where people don't migrate. So Nishant, I would like to ask, the South Indian coastal communities have been victim to several natural disasters, recurrent natural disasters. But due to their deep-rooted socio-cultural beliefs, also livelihoods, they have not adapted to the changing climate, and they also do not relocate, and are somehow, generation after generation, located in one of the most vulnerable hotspots. Now, as a planner, what would be the approach by the authorities or the planners to improve the resilience in such areas or arm them better to survive through these natural disasters?
Yeah, that is a condition that exists all over the world in East, and we've known about it for many times, this sort of resistance to change and the hanging on to conditions of pre-existence, which is a natural thing in human beings. What I would say is that, yeah, the only way I've managed, and I just say this sort of jokingly, but it's serious, the only way I've managed to get people to stop talking about natural disasters is by giving them 0 in exams in university, if they use that term. There is no such thing as a natural disaster. There are disasters associated with natural events, but they're not natural disasters, they're not acts of God, they're not things that are inevitable. They are socially constructed contexts whereby, and it's very important, it's not just a matter of the terminology. The terminology brings with it a whole view of disaster, which we're trying to get rid of, which is that they are acts of God or they're acts of nature. So when you ask people, give me an example of a disaster, and they tell you earthquake, an earthquake is not a disaster. You know, an earthquake is a physical phenomenon which has typified the world since it was created and will go on for a long time in the future. What is the problem is disaster associated with that, where human beings, like the person who asked the question, persist in living under conditions of risk or put themselves in positions or others put them in positions of risk. But a lot of it is voluntary or involuntarily socially constructed as a means. There's no solution to this. This is a common problem. I've been working in Latin America in a joint India, in fact, and people could talk to Garima there in IIHS. We did this study on relocation of urban settlements under conditions of stress and the resistances to this, because in the end it's this problem of the trade-off between everyday risk and resolving it and resolving disaster risk. And so if a population has access to resources, although minimum, has a history of occupation of territory, of use of that territory, of the resources which it provides, then it's not easily going to get up and move somewhere else. When the evidence is that most relocation of populations, resettlement of populations is not successful, works out to be completely inadequate, because of inadequate planning principles. People see it, if you're a Ministry of Housing, you see it from a housing problem. If you're a Ministry of the Environment, you see it from an environmental problem. If you're a Ministry of Social Inclusion, you see it from but you forget the rest of it. So most settlements that are constructed are completely inadequate, and the people either abandon them and migrate back to where they've come from, and then when they migrate, somebody else occupies those areas. So it's a vicious circle. But all of this is not resolvable without a change, basically, in the mental attitude, our educational approach. We're still very much based on sector and disciplinary-based approaches to understanding. So if you see disaster risk management as a sector that can actually resolve anything on its own, then you're not on the right track. It's a development planning process problem. And if there is not a move forward on the satisfaction of everyday needs, then there's not going to be a satisfaction of the needs in terms of disaster risk.
Yes. Some people, I mean, they just don't think they have the option to move. So I think the next question that we have is actually, if there is a city where more than 50% of the population are living lives in areas which are prone to hazards, how do they go about actually creating mitigation measures which will help in at least curbing the impact of any particular, I'm sorry, I'll probably end up using natural disaster again. Give me zero.
That's okay. You're not in a course in a university where I'm teaching, so you're okay.
Yeah, so I mean, what could be the mitigation measures that can be adopted in a place where more than 50% of the population is settled in hazardous zones?
Well, it is a question because, when one puts up what does one do with already existing risk-prone populations, which is an enormous number of people worldwide. In fact, it is so enormous that it is impossible economically to really resolve a problem with relocation or adequate relocation or resettlement, etc. No, and it's not even feasible to resolve it with structural measures or reorganization of urban territory mechanisms, etc. But there are, in principle, many approaches which could be used to reducing disaster risk in existing risk-prone communities without, in fact, relocating them. It all depends on where you are and what you are. If you live on mangrove swamps which have invaded illegally, it's not the same as living on a slope in a city which is going to be landsliding or on the side of a river. And so anything from sustaining slopes to reforestation of slopes through to building of dikes on riversides, all of these have been tried, etc. But our advance is not that great. The problem here is, and it really is a challenge for a new generation of thinkers, because, and that's why I mentioned the intermediate cities and their rapid growth profiles, but they haven't got to the point of almost irresolvable problems, because when you're in a city like Mexico City or Sao Paulo or Rio de Janeiro here in Latin America, and that urban risk exists, it is not easy to see how to get rid of it. And that's why we go back all the time to early warning systems, which is okay, because the prime objective of disaster risk management maybe should be to save human lives, that infrastructure and services can be replaced. Life cannot be replaced, but we cannot rely on early warning systems, and yet we don't see the alternatives we have in any great manner. But certainly on-site improvements, in Medellin in Latin America, they've done a lot of upgrading, on-site upgrading, but it all depends on the area. But one fundamental thing is that there's no way forward with a very high level of participation of the population itself, because the whole thing of disaster risk is, it's not a mental construct, but it is certainly viewed through the eyes of people, and those people aren't technical people. They are people that live their lives every day in these particular sites. And it is amazing to see how many people, because of a level of desperation associated with poverty, don't seem to be overly worried about where they're living. It's sort of like, I know that sounds rather cynical, but faced with the need for satisfying everyday needs, then the whole thing of what's going to happen in 6 months is just beyond the pale. It's today that is important. And so the planner has to be able to get into this whole cultural mindset and read the situation through the eyes of others, elicit and get support, and find the adequate solution according to means and opportunities. And there's no quick fix. There's no quick fix. This thing is like poverty. There's no quick fix. And it's not a matter of sort of shining the edges of it such that it goes away in a certain way. It's a matter of deep structural reform to be able to get to some sort of solution.
I think it's also stressing on how flexible any plan has to be. I mean, no sort of rigidity can actually be of any benefit when we're trying to deal with something like this. The next question that we have, we'll be moving to China for this. And the question is, what is your opinion on the countries restricting internal migration, like what was done in China, as to prevent unnecessary stress on the basic services in the major cities? And doesn't it, with respect to that, doesn't it make sense to limit the demand until the supply catches up? So as it's only when you see your city's infrastructure growing, do you actually allow more people to come in? Is that a way?
Well, I don't think so. That's just a particular approach that, I have the feeling, and I'm not talking about China in particular, as I don't know it sufficiently to be able to make opinions as to the way public investment is assigned to different things. But we do find in many countries, I've just done a study in the north of Honduras of a place that, under the effect of Fifi in 1994, which was a very big 1974 was a very big hurricane that killed like 8,000 people in the north of Honduras. And there's a municipality called Choloma, which at that time only had like 3,000 people in urban centers. Well, Choloma now has 300,000 people in urban centers with a massive urban growth rate over time. And most of those people have migrated to the city to work in what we call maquila, which is outbonding plants, which produce industry and textiles for re-export, etc. And a municipality which has never had money for anything cannot put up a face the infrastructural demands of that type of population. So it is a highly risk-prone area now. If another Fifi was to happen today, it would be completely different in its impacts through 1974 when few people died and few infrastructure was laid. So the whole thing of assignation of infrastructure, this is a global problem as well, because on the one hand, you can't promote urban growth because of the type of industry or the type of economy which you have promoted. And in the case of China, it's clearly industrial based more and more, and then not expect the population to move to those cities. But at the same time, you can't say, we will not accept them until we provide the infrastructure if you're not providing the infrastructure, and you're not going to provide the infrastructure. And that, I'm not talking about China now. I know in many cities in Latin America, they just do not provide the infrastructure to disadvantaged areas. In fact, the law does not allow you to do it. So you create a mechanism by which people migrate to cities and live in hazard-prone areas, and then you set up a law which says you cannot give them water and infrastructure. Water they get because it's a human right. But the rest of the infrastructure, education, or etc., they don't get. So it becomes a vicious circle. But I'm really not sure. I would like to see a re-ruralization of our economies, but that's more a sort of a thing because one dreams of such things rather than a reality. We have to live with the reality that cities are going to absorb a great part of the future population growth, and that's it in most places. And it does take us back to the argument in the 60s, the big arguments about the city as prosperity, as the opportunity and the motor of economic and social growth and justice, etc. Nowadays, obviously, the arguments are different, tinged with other things, but it's a reality. It's there. It's there.
I think, like you said, that cities are going to take in more of the burden of the population. Moving back to India, as per the last census, it was said that almost 6.5 persons are living in a single room in urban slums. So do you think that the congestion is one of the major factors that will have an immense impact or enhance the vulnerability in urban areas? This is a question from Deepak.
Yeah, well, that goes back to this when I talked about urban risk being the product of urban processes. Well, one of the defining urban processes is the process of concentration, centralization, and densification. And so it's clear that when densification and concentration occurs on a place affected by a possible physical event, then the levels of exposure increase. And if you have situations of 6.5 people per capita in a house in an exposed hazard-prone area, then your risk is growing enormously. This happened in this case I was telling about, Choloma in Honduras, that because of people working in the maquila industry and because of a lack of available housing and the lack of available services, you get like 3 work components in the same house. So one sleeps from such and such a time to such and such a time, while the other person is out working in the maquila. They come back and sleep in the bed, then the other person goes. So you have 3 families living in a single house. Of course, under conditions of exclusion, etc., your disaster risk increases enormously. So densification is clearly a problem which contributes. The vulnerability is in the condition which creates the need to do that. That's what the vulnerability factor is, which then increases exposure to the physical event itself. So yeah, definitely.
I think the next question that we have from Nishan is, if, like what we discussed about the tendency of people to stay back considering their socio-cultural beliefs and livelihood, Nishan would like to know, should we try and limit further densification of coastal cities, considering the future sea level rise? And if that is the case, should we really have a pessimistic approach that we as the citizens of the world may not be able to control the sea level rise?
Well, I think, the notion of sea level rise and its existence is a reality, and it will carry on because, as most projections say, even if we control the emissions today, we still have sufficient up there to make climate change over the next 100 years in one way or another. So I think one has to assume that sea level rise is a reality and differentially will affect different parts. The fact is also that a big proportion of humanity lives on the coast or within a limited distance from the coast. And so we have a challenge because it's not just the challenge of sea rise, it's the challenge of tornadoes, of hurricanes, and of wave action in general, etc. And so there's no way in which coastal cities in the future cannot take into consideration sea level rise. Now, the problem is when this contradicts in other circumstances, for instance, in coastal areas that are tourist centres, in Barbados or the Bahamas, in the Caribbean, although we know that sea level rise, it's very difficult to persuade people in a vacationing area that you don't build your hotel on a beach, right? Because nobody goes to a beach resort to have a hotel in the hills or set back 100 meters. So there's a whole series of contradictions, but there really is no way in which we can ignore the need for urban planning and and the problem is, again, that there is now a vast amount of infrastructure and population located in in what would become changed hazard conditions, and this is one of the things, that hazards are dynamic, changing over time according to different factors, etc. But we have things which are now set in time, and how we deal with that is extremely difficult. And I come back again to the, okay, we could have another, how many billion people living in cities within 30 years or 40 years that don't exist. The whole thing of prospective disaster risk management is not the solution to everything, because the corrective part is enormous, the things that now exist that have to be in some way changed. But if we don't get on top of prospective management, which is not really a disaster risk management challenge, prospective management is really sustainable development planning, and building correctly in the right place is not disaster risk reduction. That is good professional practice. We don't live on this earth to be in disassociation with our environment. Every architect and engineer knows that. So if you build a building to withstand earthquakes, that's not disaster risk management. That is good professional practice. And so the challenge here is to desectoralize the whole notion of disaster risk management, that it has to be in the sectors. It's not a matter that we introduce it into it. They have to discover in their own practice the need for considering risk in their investment patterns, all sectors, all territories, municipal, etc. And so I know that I'm avoiding things because I don't have a solution. This thing is really difficult. It really is. It's not as easy as deciding the economic path of a country in the sense you want to move from this to that, and you can introduce fiscal reforms and economic measures. This is a derived thing. So we're very much in the hands of what's going on in that global economy, and all of this risk is changing enormously. Just take the case, for instance, of being in coastal locations. With the big flooding in Thailand, like 10 years ago when the Rio Chapraya flooded, Honda and Toyota lost something like $1.6 billion in direct losses, because they were located in the floodplain of a river. Why are they located in the floodplain of a river? Ask yourself, why were they, along with another 70 or 80 companies who, after the event, said they would stay there? So the problem is that disaster risk is, in fact, opportunity and loss. One of the easiest interpretations of what we're dealing with is that all locations which suffer hazard events are resource-based areas. So being by the side of a river, being by the side of an ocean, being by the side of being on a slope of a volcano, that offers resources for agriculture, for production, for trade, for etc. But they're affected by hazards every 50 years, 100, or daily, or yearly, etc. But it's a trade-off between the two. The disaster risk management thing is a trade-off between opportunities and hazards in different time periods. And so when a population group says, I'm not moving from here to there because you say that I'm hazard prone, etc., I'm not moving because my time frame and my resource hazard frame says I will stay here because I do have access to the work I've been doing. Although it's inadequate from your perspective, it is something that I've built up as a lifestyle and I live with. And so, it's a very difficult thing, and it can only be done participatorily.
I think when you talk about what just happened in Thailand with Honda and Toyota, either they were completely ignorant of the risks that lay to that location, or they chose to ignore it. But on that cue, the next question is from Paloma, and I'm sorry.
Well, let me just say that apparently from the study, they were offered tax incentives to be there by government. So why? Now, I remember when I was at university in the 60s in England, but in India, for instance, when there was scandal about exporting contaminating industry out of Europe to India, etc., that the Ministry of Industry in India supposedly said, forget about that, I need employment. So where there's opportunity or hazard, it's trade-offs all the way around. Getting to understand it is not that easy, so. Okay, sorry.
I think this just makes the next question far more relevant. The next question is from Paloma, and the previous question on congestion was also from Paloma. So she would like to know that, do you think the master plans of the city should have a separate disaster management and mitigation plan integrated into the planning system that can reduce the risks of urban disasters? I mean, here we are talking about maybe the uninitiated, but who would still refer to a master plan to know what lies ahead. Do you think it's important that we integrate actually a particular section on it, dedicate one?
No, that's a very good good comment and good question, because it does bring us down to the segregation of thought patterns and segregation of things as if they were separate from others. And so, at local levels, I come from an urban and regional planning background. That's what I did my doctorate in, what I taught and researched for years before getting into this strange disaster risk area. And every time I go to local areas or cities and I see this multiplicity of plans, you have a local or city development plan, then you have a disaster risk management plan, then you have an environmental management plan, and then you have something else and something else. In the end, this has to be more deductive, right? Because the general thing is the development plan. But that development plan will affect risk and will be affected by risk or hazard. And so it is not a matter of having it accompanying the plan. It must be an integral part of it. It is part of the opportunities and disadvantages of achieving, in terms of achieving something. So in the same way as a land use plan obviously derive from the ideas on development which you have, and where the efficiency of a city will affect your opportunities for development. So in the end, this is a matter of getting the hierarchy of plans correct. And definitely the hazard base of a plan, without talking about vulnerability for the moment, because as I say, if we get rid of, to the maximum possible, exposure, then we don't have a worry about disaster risk. We may have a worry about many other things, but we don't have a worry about exposure if we're not putting industry in the floodplain of Rio Chapraya or whatever. And so I think the question is really relevant in the sense that it has to be part of a fundamental basis of the development plan. But what we've known, and this was brought up by the Global Assessment Report on many occasions, and was looked at by the Economist, through its consultancy units, is that if you went to a country like Indonesia some years ago and you looked at its prospectus for development and its search to attract industry or investment, or any other country, I mentioned Indonesia, it could be any other, then it would never even mention the hazard factors that existed in the country. All it would do would talk about the advantages for your investment. But it was as if the world was without hazards. You could just, and Indonesia is probably the most disaster risk prone country in the world, almost amongst the top 5. But in the development prospectus. And so a city that does not take, and here there's an interesting thing as well. The World Bank now and the Overseas Development Institute in London have worked on this notion of the triple dividend of disaster risk management. What is the triple dividend? One dividend is that you reduce the possibility of loss and damage, okay? But the other is that by assuring security in certain areas, or the areas which are being developed, you attract investment and therefore employment, etc. And the other is the multi-use, or the multiple use of the investment in disaster risk management mitigation measures. So your dike could be an area where you could cycle on top of it or something and do physical exercise. There's a case in the United States where a big stadium was built to receive floodwaters in the case of flooding, and when not, it's for concerts, rock concerts. So if we start to amplify our vision of disaster risk management and look at it from a perspective of attracting investment, and so definitely, the question, you have to have this as a basis, but it doesn't have to be something apart. It has to be formulated in the moment that development parameters and the search for development practice is being instigated.
It's basically, if we are prone to disasters, we might as well embrace it, acknowledge it, and do what we can about it, but go with it, not try to go against it. I think based on that, we have a follow-up question. Since, of course, none of the countries, most of the countries do not want to talk about the disasters when trying to welcome investments, do you think that something like a social and environmental impact assessment study or vulnerability studies should be made absolutely legally mandatory before drafting any such development plan and master plan question? Like that should be on the path of conception of any such plan.
Well, historically, we've had environmental impact analysis, which is the analysis of what we do, what it does to what we call the natural environment. And so that has been mandatory, but not very often followed up on in Latin America anyway. It's been on the books for years. The other side of the equation is, of course, the impact of the environment on us, which is a different question, because it's in one, it's what we're going to do to damage the existing environment or change its parameters. And the other one is what the environment as it produces its earthquakes and its volcanoes and its typhoons, etc., will do to us. They're obviously complementary, and they should be integrated as one single type of evaluation. And why? Because more and more, the hazards we're facing up to are not natural. They are socio-natural, what we're calling socio-natural in Latin America and other parts. What do I mean by that? When you deforest, you increase the possibility of flooding, of erosion, of sedimentation, of landsliding. When you construct a city like Houston and you cover over a natural area of water absorption and you put cement, when it floods in that city, that's not a natural event. That is a socio-natural event. We've changed. And so environmental impact analysis is about, okay, I intervene the environment, but we should also think not only of the loss of value in the environment, we should think that, when I intervene and I cut a road through an area and I don't do the sides of it correct, then it's going to be landsliding all the time, and that happens all the time. So basically, it's environmental impact analysis and risk analysis in development processes are fundamentally complementary. And here in Latin America, I'm just in a meeting now for 2 days here in San Jose with people from Mexico and Chile and Costa Rica about the public investment systems. We've been working with them for 20 years now, almost, from Peru starting, on getting risk implicated with public decision investment processes. And it's not easy. It's not easy because a lot of people say why, a lot of people say how. It's just too many projects. How do we prioritize what we look at, etc.? But eventually we have to get that in there. There was a time when the international development banks couldn't care a damn about that. They just give money to countries and never insist on it. And they saw their investments eroded through things like Mitch in Central America and this, etc. Eventually, or not eventually, now we have to get to it.
I think as a follow-up of that, Deepak would like to know, then, if this is the case, then what is the way forward for building a resilient city?
Well, don't get me on the topic of resilience. I hate the word. I'm one of the deniers. I can say that in other words which are far more accessible because of the multiple interpretation of resilience. And I'm not sure how the question is formulated. We use resilience in the way which child psychology, engineering, and ecosystem analysis through the great thinkers from Canada. Then that's one thing. That is the response to the impact of something. It is ex post. Now, I'm not sure that then puts us into building back better, to transformation, etc. So I don't know, because resilience is a very tricky word. It really is. It's become popular. It's become all over the place, and everybody uses it in different ways. And now I have to sit down, in fact, in the next month and write a document on resilience for a project where I'm almost obliged to use the word. But what I'm going to do is reduce it to its essential components and what it's actually saying, because it becomes pre-impact, during impact, and post-impact. That's the way it's being used more and more generally, when it really is a term that says, how does a system, a structure, a society react to impact in a way which gives it a better opportunity for reconstituting itself? But now they say that's not sufficient, that's bouncing back. Now we have to bounce forward. So that becomes transformational. But anyway, there's a good book by Mark Pelling on resilience from a geographical disaster risk management perspective, which I could recommend. But I'm not going to get into it at 5 o'clock in the morning. It seems a little bit over the top. But I thank you for the question.
So this sort of brings us to the last question for the day. We have a question from Delhi, where Pavani asks, Delhi is a city that is becoming riskier to love each passing day because of the increasing pollution and safety issues. I understand Mexico also recently had severe pollution issues and has dealt with it. Could you shed light on how they dealt with it?
Well, a combination. I lived in Mexico for 8 years, and I got out of Mexico precisely because of the pollution problems that were starting to occur in the early 80s. And I moved to Costa Rica, which doesn't have any industry and doesn't have any pollution, really. It does, but not that much. And it's a combination of restricting circulation of vehicles on certain days, the reduction of contaminating fuels. Industry has been severely cut back on in terms of pollution levels, etc. And this brings us to the question of when is it possible to do these things? Yeah, I remember London in 1952 was set in a smog that killed 1,000 people in one single night. Some of them were dropped into the River Thames because they could not see where they were walking. A lot died from bronchial problems and because it was in winter and it was a smog. And after that, London cleaned itself up in very little time, the same with the River Thames. But it requires, obviously, getting to an inflection point when this is not just a circumstance, it becomes a social problem. And so the whole thing about public policy is so critical, but the factors which condition public policy are numerous, and there's times when things go by for years and years and years. Yeah, it's a challenge. Cities the size of Delhi or of Sao Paulo or Santiago de Chile in Latin America still have severe contamination problems, but the routes are more or less clear. Public transport, downgrading of cars and petroleum use, move to electricity, etc., etc. And with climate change, which will change the whole context of cities, and the urban heat island effect, for instance, could become greater. Yeah, if we don't move, then it could become far serious in the future.
That sort of brings us to the end of this webinar. I mean, this last 1 hour just flew by, and we had some amazing questions. And thank you so much, Allan, for taking time out to answer these queries that we have. We still do have some more questions, which maybe we can, since time is up today, we might be able to send them to you later, and we can reply to them over our forum. But
perfect. Or if maybe we can organize another session. I'm not sure how you guys are set up, but
that would be amazing. That would be absolutely fantastic. I mean, I think we can try and schedule that, and I think I mean our students would really look forward to that. But thank you so much for this, and thank you everyone for your active participation. There were some really insightful questions, and till the next webinar, we will keep you posted. Thank you so much. Thanks a lot.
Thank you all. Thank you very much indeed. Bye-bye, and we'll see you again in the future.